I thought the worst thing my brother could do was steal every dollar I had and disappear without a trace. I was wrong. Because 2 days later, when my phone lit up with his name, the voice on the other end wasn't angry, smug, or sorry. It was terrified. By the time I understood why, it was already too late to turn back. What started as a betrayal inside my own family became something darker, uglier, and painfully familiar. Money was only the beginning. The real shock was what happened after he ran, and who decided he looked guilty before anyone even knew the truth. How did one desperate act spiral into a nightmare shaped by fear, power, and racism? Before everything collapsed, my life was quiet in the kind of way I had worked hard to earn. I kept my head down, paid my bills on time, and tried to believe that if I stayed disciplined, I could build something solid no one could take from me. I had a steady routine, a small apartment, a decent job, and just enough savings spread across my accounts to feel like I was finally breathing instead of just surviving. My brother had never lived that way. He moved through life like rules were suggestions made for other people. He drifted from job to job, borrowed money he never repaid, and always seemed to carry chaos with him like a shadow. Still, he was my brother. No matter how many times he disappointed me, some part of me kept hoping he would settle down, get serious, and stop treating every problem like something he could outrun. A week before he vanished, he showed up acting different. Not calmer, not better, just tense. The kind of tense that sat behind his eyes and made every silence feel loaded. He was checking his phone constantly, glancing out windows, speaking less than usual. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself I was done getting dragged into his messes. Then I woke up and found my accounts nearly empty. At first, it felt unreal, like some banking error that would be fixed with one call. But deep down, even before I saw the transfer trail, I think I already knew. And what I didn't know then was that the money he took was about to pull both of us into something far bigger than theft, something cruel, public, and impossible to undo. I called the bank first, then the police, then my brother over and over until the calls went straight to voicemail. Every answer I got made the room feel smaller. The withdrawals were real. The transfers were deliberate. Someone had used information only a person close to me would know. By noon, I wasn't trying to convince myself anymore. He had done it. I drove to the last place I knew he had been staying, a rundown motel near the edge of town where people kept their curtains shut even in the middle of the day. His car was gone. The front desk claimed they hadn't seen anything. A man smoking outside watched me too closely, like he knew more than he wanted to say. I remember feeling anger first, hot and sharp, but underneath it was something heavier. My brother didn't just steal from me because he was reckless. He stole because he was running from something. That night, his name started spreading online. A local crime page posted grainy security footage from an ATM. It showed a black man in a hoodie making a withdrawal from my account. The image was blurred, the lighting was bad, and his face was only half visible, but none of that mattered. The comments filled in the blanks faster than facts ever could. People called him a thug, a scammer, an animal. They talked about him like they had been waiting for a reason. It didn't matter that no one knew what had happened. It didn't matter that he was still just a suspect. In their minds, his skin had already proven the case. And then things got worse. By the next morning, local pages were sharing his picture beside words like dangerous and armed, even though no weapon had ever been mentioned. A rumor spread that he had robbed me at gunpoint. Another claimed he was part of a fraud ring. People who had never met either of us were building a story they wanted to believe, and the story sounded familiar. A black man accused of a crime was no longer a person. He became a warning, a symbol, a target. When the police finally contacted me, I thought they would be focused on recovering the money.
Instead, they wanted to know what kind of person he was, whether he had a temper, whether he had been involved in gangs, whether I felt safe around him. The questions weren't really questions, they were invitations to confirm the version of him they had already accepted. I told him he had stolen from me, yes. I told him he was impulsive, yes. But every time I tried to explain that he was more complicated than the image exploding online, I could feel their interest fade. Complexity wasn't useful to them. Guilt was. Then 2 days after he vanished, my phone rang. His name flashed across the screen, and for 1 second I almost didn't answer. When I did, all I heard was breathing, ragged, broken, panicked. No apology, no explanation, just raw fear pouring through the speaker. He sounded like a man who had seen something that had stripped him down to pure survival. Before the line cut out, I caught enough to understand that he was hurt, hiding, and convinced nobody would believe him. I stood there with the phone still in my hand, trying to process what I had heard. The brother I had been furious with was suddenly terrified of something far bigger than prison. And the most chilling part was this. For the first time, I believed him. Because in a town where people had already decided what kind of monster he was, what would happen if someone decided they didn't have to wait for the law at all?
I traced the call to an industrial strip just beyond downtown. A place of empty warehouses, chain-link fences, and cracked pavement that swallowed sound. By the time I got there, police lights were already washing the buildings in red and blue. Officers were moving fast, hands near their weapons, shouting toward a loading dock half hidden in darkness. My brother was there. He was on the ground before I even saw his face. Not because he was fighting, not because he had a weapon, because someone had seen a black man bleeding, stumbling, and desperate, and decided that was enough to call in a threat instead of a victim. The story online had arrived before he did. By then, he wasn't a person in trouble. He was the man people had been warned to fear. I pushed closer and saw his shirt soaked through, one side of his body dark with blood. His hands were shaking so hard they barely looked human. He kept trying to lift himself, not to run, but to speak, to point, to make them understand something behind the warehouse. But every movement made the officers bark louder, their voices stacked on top of each other until panic became its own kind of trap. Then I saw what he had been trying to show them. A second figure lay near the loading dock, barely visible in the shadows. Another man, injured, maybe worse. In one brutal instant, everything shifted. My brother hadn't just been hiding, he had been running from whoever did that. The stolen money, the motel, the fear in his voice, it had all led here. But none of it mattered in that moment, because the only story anyone wanted was the easiest one. Black man, blood, crime scene, guilt. And as officers closed in on him with guns drawn, even while he was collapsing in plain sight, I understood something that made my stomach turn cold. He could survive the theft, the chase, even the truth, but surviving people's assumptions was a different fight entirely.
In the end, the truth came out in pieces, and none of it erased what had already been done. My brother had stolen my money to pay a man who had been threatening him over a debt tied to people far more dangerous than he ever admitted. When the exchange went wrong, violence followed. He ran, injured, terrified, and desperate for help. But before anyone asked what happened, the town had already decided what kind of story they were looking at. He survived. Barely. The other injured man survived too, and the investigation eventually exposed enough facts to tear apart the rumors that had spread online. No armed robbery, no gang ring, no mastermind criminal people had invented from a blurry image and their own prejudice. Just a broken situation made even more dangerous by the speed of public judgment and the weight of racial bias. I got some of my money back, not all of it, but the money stopped mattering after a while. What stayed with me was the image of my brother bleeding on the ground, trying to point toward the truth while people looked at him and saw only threat. He had done something wrong, that part was real,
But wrongdoing should never cancel out someone's humanity. And in too many cases, for black men especially, suspicion comes first, force comes next, and truth arrives last, if it arrives at all. That is how racism often works now. Not always with slurs or signs, sometimes with assumptions, with headlines, with comments, with the kind of fear that turns a wounded man into a target before he ever gets the chance to explain. So ask yourself this: when the next blurry image, the next viral accusation, the next dangerous suspect starts spreading across your screen, will you pause long enough to question the story you're being handed? Because someone's life may depend on it.